بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. We are continuing to look at the sections on the funerary practices from Maraqi al-Falah, and we reached فصل في حملها ودفنها, the chapter on carrying, on bearing and burying the deceased. And so he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, and of course there's great merit in carrying the deceased, right? Right, and this is frequently a neglected sunnah in our time, especially because people, for convenience purposes, they use different carriers, etc. So they just have one person who just takes it away, right? But there are sunnahs related to burial; they should be observed, right? And when there's unawareness of them, they should be positively encouraged, right? They should be positively encouraged, right? ويسن قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمه الله تعالى ويسن لحملها حمل 4 رجال تكريما له وتخفيفا وتحاشيا عن تشبيهه بحمل الأمتعة. It is a sunnah for carrying the deceased that they be carried by 4 men out of honoring the deceased, right? And and Tahtawi mentioned some of the hadiths related to this, right? And to make it easier on those carrying, and to avoid resembling carrying the deceased to be like just carrying any belongings, right? Because this is a believer, right? It's not, it's not just a bag of, a bag of belongings. ويكره حمله على ظهر دابة بلا عذر. It is disliked to carry it on the back of an animal without excuse, right? Because it has the sense of neglect, and leaving the honor, right? And this is from the Prophet ﷺ, what he referred to as the haqqul Muslim, right? That there's the rights of the believer on a believer, and one of them is that they died. There's a number of things that are expected to be done on behalf of the deceased, unless there's an excuse, right? Now, if they're put on something to facilitate the carrying, but it should still be followed by this number of believers. والصغير يحمله واحد على يديه. But an infant may be carried just by one in their hands. ويتداوله الناس كذلك بأيديهم. And people can switch hands with the child. وينبغي لكل واحد حملها 40 خطوة يبدأ الحامل بمقدمها الأيمن. It is proper, meaning it's recommended. ينبغي, it's generally used for recommendation. It's للحث, right? It's for encouragement. Sometimes it's للحث المؤكد, but sometimes it can indicate more than that, depending on the underlying meaning. But generally, it's used for the ما ينبغي is used for ما فيه حث, right? أي استحباب. That it be carried 40 steps. And the one carrying it start with the front right. فيضعه على يمينه, right? So one places it on one's right. So the front right would be relative to the direction of the one carrying it, right? Because let's say, if this were the deceased, right? You were carrying it in that direction forwards, right? You start by carrying it on your right um, shoulder, right? Right, so that you are, so you are actually, so on your right shoulder, right? On your right shoulder in the direction of that you're going, right? Um, and of course, this is when you have a choice. This is when you have a choice. If someone's already there on the right side, then الاستعجال بالحمل أولى, right? Then you start from wherever there's a gap, right? على يمينه على عاتقه الأيمن ويمينها أي الجنازة, and on the right of the جنازة مكان جهة اليسار, and the right of the جنازة is that which is on the left of the deceased. الحامل لأن الميت يلقى على ظهره, because the deceased is placed on their back, right? ثم يضع مؤخرها الأيمن عليه, right? Then one places one's, and this he's complicating it a bit. He puts the back right on your right shoulder, right, which would be the left of the direction in which you're going. ثم يضع مقدمها الأيسر على يساره. Then, so you carry for a bit on the right shoulder, then you carry it on your left shoulder, right? If this is you're carrying it, or you walk on that side if it's being borne on something. ثم يختم بالجانب الأيسر. Then one finishes with the left side بحملها عليه, by carrying it on one's left shoulder. فيكون من كل جانب 10 خطوات. So you walk at least, this is تحديدا للأدنى, walking at least 10 steps from each side. Front right, back right, front left, back left, right? But also one keeps in mind the facilitation. This is the least that is recommended if you want to fulfill the recommendation. But if you only do it from one direction, then strive to walk 40 steps, carrying it directly or accompanying it. In the tazahum, if there's already too many people, if you can't carry the janazah, you walk with it, and you have the intention of carrying it, right? لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, because the words of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, right? And this is narrated in secondary sources. That من حمل جنازة 40 خطوة كفرت عنه 40 كبيرة, right? That whoever carries a janazah for 40 steps, it expiates 40 enormities, right? ولقول أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه من حمل الجنازة بجوانبها الأربعة فقد قضى الذي عليه, because the words of Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, and this is related by Abdul Razak in his Musannaf, which with the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba is one of the great compendia of narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, but also of the notably, distinctively of the companions radiallahu ta'ala anhum, right? And it's one of those works that is still not properly fully published, despite some efforts of some notable hadith experts of our times, but that's a separate investigation and consideration. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Sorry about that. So then, so Abu Hurairah said, whoever carries the janazah from all four sides has fulfilled what they owe, meaning of the rights of the deceased, right? And this is recommended. ويستحب الإسراع بها, is recommended to hasten in carrying the deceased, right? But as he'll say, دون خبب, without rushing, right? Such that it is unbecoming, or it endangers the stability of the one being carried. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم أسرعوا بالجنازة, because the general call of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, the hadith is in the Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, that hasten in carrying the funeral, but without أي بدون ما دون الخبب, without rushing in a blameworthy way, كما في رواية ابن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه فإن تلك صالحة فخير تقدمونها إليه, because this is because of the narration of Ibn Mas'ud, because that is a virtuous thing to do, because you are either sending them forth towards the good, so hasten it. وإن تكوا غير ذلك فشر تضعونه عن رقابكم, or it is an evil that you are lifting from your necks, meaning from your responsibility. And this is in Abu Dawud. وكذا يستحب الإسراع بتجهيزه. Likewise, it is recommended to hasten in readying the deceased. You know, all the funeral rites. It's a recommendation that one hasten it. And that's an emphasized recommendation. It's blameworthy to delay without reasonable excuse, right? بلا خبب, but without haste, you know, blameworthy or dangerous haste. بخاء معجمة وموحدتين مفتوحتين خبب ضرب من العدو دون العنق. والعنق خطو فسيح, right? So it is to rush without taking big steps, right? فيمشون به ما دون العنق, so that one walks without taking excessively big or excessively hasty steps. وهو ما يؤدي إلى اضطراب الميت, and خبب is that which would cause, so either you take excessively big steps or you rush, so that would cause the deceased to be disturbed. فيكره للازدراء به, because this is blameworthy for two reasons. One, because it's unbefitting the dignity of the deceased, and secondly, because of the danger in it, that it could fall. وإتعاب المتبعين, and not to tire those who are following, because people frequently die in old age, and they're likely to be old people and weak people following them, right? Now, of course, in this, some people like sharing this, some wacky videos about, you know, but the believer is an intelligent person, not a fool. They have these videos and of people dancing when they're carrying some coffin or whatever. This is blameworthy, right? It's unbecoming the dignity of a human being, right? So sometimes anyone can be given to folly, but we should recognize our folly and not, you know, when you share things that may seem funny or whatever, but just consider, is this correct? والمشي خلفها أفضل من المشي أمامها كفضل صلاة الفرض على النفل. Walking in front of the janazah is superior to walking behind it, with the superiority of the fard over the nafil. Because of why? So it, of course, this is saying, so carrying the janazah is very meritorious if you're able to, but you know, we defer to you know, to the family and to the seniors, but everyone should try to get their share in it. And it's from the adab, you carry it for a little bit, then let somebody else carry it as well. But walking behind the funeral is also highly meritorious, right? And walking behind is superior to walking ahead, because it's like the imam, conceptually, right? The imam of this act of, you know, just like with the janazah, etc. The focal point is the janazah. You walk behind it. And لقول سيدنا علي كرم الله تعالى وجهه والذي بعث سيدنا محمدا عليه الصلاة والسلام بالحق إن فضل الماشي خلفها على الماشي أمامها كفضل المكتوبة على التطوع. Because of the words of Sayyidina Ali رضي الله تعالى عنه, that by the one who sent our Master Muhammad with the truth, peace and blessings be upon him. Truly, the virtue of walking behind the janazah over walking in front of it is like the virtue of the obligatory prayer over the voluntary prayer. قال سيدنا أبو سعيد الخدري رضي الله تعالى عنه أرأيتك تقول أم بشيء سمعته من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So Abu Sa'id asked Sayyidina Ali, am I seeing you affirm something yourself, or is this something you heard from the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم? فغضب. So he was upset. فقال لا والله. He said, no, by Allah. بل سمعته غير مرة ولا اثنتين ولا ثلاث حتى عد سبعا. Says, this is something I heard not just once, not just twice. And he counted up to 7. فقال أبو سعيد رضي الله تعالى عنه إني رأيت أبا بكر وعمر يمشيان أمامها. So Abu Sa'id said, but I saw Abu Bakr and Umar walking in front of it. And Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, of course, a notable companion himself, right? فقال سيدنا علي كرم الله تعالى وجهه يغفر الله لهما. May Allah forgive them. فقد سمعا ذلك من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كما سمعته. For they heard that from the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم as I heard it. وإنهما والله لخير هذه الأمة. And truly by Allah, they're the best of this community. ولكنهما كرها أن يجتمع الناس ويتضايقوا. But they disliked that the people gather and it become tight. Right? So in itself, it is so much superior to walk behind the janazah. But because so many people would follow the janazah, they dislike that people rush. فأحبا أن يسهلا على الناس. So they preferred to facilitate things for people. So they walked ahead, right? And this is that sometimes what is in itself better may be forgone due to secondary considerations. But for one who has that judgment, and that's why adab is learned through observation, because the adab and adab, the right way of doing things entails knowing what is right, but how to apply it in the right way. And very often and that's why suhbah is so important, right? Why suhbah is so important, to observe how people do things, how the people of knowledge, wisdom, taqwa, right, good character, implement the sunnah, right? And one thing you see is they implement the sunnah effortlessly, without takalluf, without making it difficult for people, right? There's many lessons in this. Right? But of course, Imam al-Zayla'i points out that there's also great merit in walking ahead of it in itself, right? Right? Now, in some cases, it may be better to walk ahead. Right? So Imam Tahtawi quotes the ikhtiyar that if there's women gathered or other munkar taking place behind it, it's better to walk ahead. But Imam Ibn al-Humam mentions in Fath Qadir, one shouldn't walk so much ahead that you're not considered to be following the janazah. You're not considered to be with the janazah. And then he says, وَلِقَوْلِ سَيِّدِنَا أَبِي أُمَامَةَ رضي الله تعالى عنه إن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مشى خلف جنازة ابنه إبراهيم حافيا. That the Prophet, the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, walked behind the janazah of his son Ibrahim barefoot. Right? Now, it's not in itself superior to walk barefoot for the janazah, right? But it is from the sunnah on some occasion to walk barefoot, because in this and many other hadiths, it is established that the Prophet ﷺ on occasion walked barefoot. So what does he mention in الطريقة المحمدية about walking barefoot? Right? It is walking barefoot is from the sunnahs of habit. You are not specifically expected to walk barefoot. Have you ever walked barefoot in public, Sidi Zain?
I don't think so.
Okay. So you're not considered to have left the sunnah, but disliking walking barefoot in public is religiously disliked. Why? Because it is from the sunnah, from the sunan al-adat of of Sayyid al-Sadat. Right? It's from the sunnahs of habit of the very best of God's creation. Right? And it's good with any of the sunnahs of habit to try to practice it at least once. Right? In a manner, but the sunnah al-adat are done in a manner that's appropriate. You're going to your backyard, just go someday go barefoot, for example, right? Or you're going to pick up something from the driveway, whatever. Just take a few steps barefoot, intend the sunnah. Okay. ويكره أن يتقدم الكل عليها أو ينفرد واحد متقدما. It's improper that everybody be ahead of the janazah, because there's no discernible reason to do so. Or only one walk ahead, because that is, the idea of mukhalafat al-jama'ah, you're going against the group, right? Unless everybody else is heedless of the blameworthy thing. So this is something to keep in mind, and it gets challenging sometimes, right? In itself, like for example, if they're driving the janazah to the parking lot, it's best to go behind the car carrying the janazah. It's best, unless there are secondary considerations, right? ولا بأس بالركوب خلفها من غير إضرار لغيره. There's nothing wrong with riding behind the janazah, right? As long as it does not hurt or inconvenience anybody else. وفي السنن, and in the works of sunan, right? The sunan, of course, primarily refers to the 6 books. Sometimes the sunan refers to the 4 books besides the sahihain. Right? The earlier ulama, the place of Sunan ibn Majah became cemented when they talk about the 6 books a little bit later. Right? Earlier, frequently they would consider the Muwatta to be from the Sitta. Right? But here, so Sunan can refer to the Sunan Sitta, the 6 principal collections of hadith. Sometimes Sunan can also refer to the 6 books, the 4 besides Bukhari and Muslim. And that's what appears to be the case here, according to Maulana al-Tahtawi. الراكب يسير خلف الجنازة. That the riding person should be behind the janazah. والماشي أمامها, and the one walking in front of it. قريبا منها, close to it. عن يمينها, to its right. أو عن يسارها, or to its left. And this hadith is understood to mention in front, ولو أمامها, and the one walking can also be in front of it. Right? This is للجواز لا لبيان الأفضل. This is to affirm what is permissible, not what is. And there are adab of walking behind the janazah. Imam Tahtawi mentions here a whole bunch of them, but this is a time of reflection. This is a time of reflection. You can look at this section in Kitab al-Adhkar of Imam Nawawi, but you reflect first and foremost about yourself. أكثر ذكر هادم اللذات, make much remembrance of the destroyer of all pleasure, namely death. First, you reflect on your own reality and your own state and how ready you are for death. Right? And then you reflect on the other person's death insofar as having mercy for them and praying for them. And if they're of the righteous, you think about the good that they did. Right? It's from adab not to think about their ill deeds. If the Prophet said, um, remember the good qualities of the deceased. Right? And it's disliked to engage in worldly speech or in useless discussion. Right? And it's a time of one of the critical times in one's life for reflection. Right? Hmm? Right? And um, and there's a very nice discussion here. Um, and then he says um, that وَيُكْرَهُ رَفْعُ الصَّوْتِ بِالذِّكْرِ وَالْقُرْآنِ. It is disliked to raise one's voice with dhikr or Quran when following the janazah. وَعَلَيْهِمْ بِالصَّمْتِ. عَلَيْهِمُ الصَّمْتِ. And it's proper, it's befitting them to be silent. Right? وَقَوْلُهُمْ أي جهرا كل حي سيموت ونحو ذلك خلف الجنازة بدعة. And they're declaring everyone who's living shall die. Everyone who's living shall die. And the like of it behind the janazah is makruh. Right? It's a bid'ah. Raising one's voice with dhikr, right? Um, right? Um, right? There are adab again that are mentioned, and he quotes Ibn Amir Hajj from the Halba, Sharh al-Munyat al-Musalli, Halbat al-Mujalli, and also from Shir'at al-Islam, which is a gem of a book. Right? That if you see a janazah walking by, if you cannot follow it, then to take heed, right? To recite relevant verses of Quran and to make dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And you can see that in Tahtawi. Right? And Imam Tahtawi mentions here that it is sunnah to make much tasbih and tahleel behind the janazah. To say subhanallah, la ilaha illallah. Right? And not to engage in worldly speech. And not to look around and stuff. This is not the time to notice, oh, so and so is wearing some really fancy, because that hardens the heart more than heedlessness at other times. Right? Um, but the raising the voice with dhikr, a number of the late scholars said that if people are in a state of heedlessness and one raises one's voice with dhikr, right, so that people don't engage, so people aren't heedless, or people don't engage in blameworthy things, then this is being done due to shari'i secondary considerations, right? And so that would be considered to be good, right? That would be considered to be good. And some of the ulama chose it. This is mentioned by Shaykh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi in several of his treatises and books, and many of the later scholars said that, yeah, because of people are engaged in the blameworthy, so and at the very least with the intention of reminding them, right? So that helps them. Okay, ويكره اتباع النساء الجنائز. It's makruh for women to follow the janazah, right? This is makruh tahriman, right? Right? And they say this is for various reasons, right? One of them being that that if they're going to be overwhelmed by sorrow, right? And and because crying out loud and stuff is makruh, number one. Number two, because in following janazah they would be crowding, and that's improper for women to be part of like a crowd where there's bumping and shoving and so on. But if it's free of those two, then it's the الحكم يدور مع علته إثباتا ونفيا. The ruling revolves around its cause in affirming and negating. Right? وإن لم تنزجر نائحة فلا بأس بالمشي معها. If a wailing woman, and they in the in Jahiliyyah, the Arabs used to hire wailers, and women's wailing would be more dramatic. Um, then there's nothing wrong with walking with her, right? But لكن يبتعد بقدر الإمكان. But one distance oneself as much as one can from them. وينكره بقلبه, and one forbids it with one's heart. Meaning, if one cannot forbid it explicitly, right? بقلبه أي ولو بقلبه, even if it's only with one's heart. The basis is that you must forbid the wrong, right? Because so this is understood, because there's nothing wrong with walking with the wailing person if you have to, but if you've forbidden them effectively, then khalas, you're not no longer walking with them, right? That's presupposed. ولا بأس بالبكاء بدمع في منزل للميت. There's nothing wrong with crying with tears. With crying, even with tears, because there's levels of crying, right? There's silent crying, which is without tears. There's crying with tears, but then there's crying out loud, and there's crying with wailing, right? So one can cry even with tears, even in the house of the mayyit, right? Right, right. And the Prophet ﷺ cried, as we know. And I encourage you to read the section on باب بكاء النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم in the Shama'il. You can look in the Hashi and the Sharh of Al-Bajuri or Mulla Ali al-Qari. ويكره النوح والصياح وشق الجيوب. It is makruh tahriman, very severely prohibited, and it's obligatory to forbid such practices, to wail or scream or to tear one's clothing. ولا يقوم من مرت به جنازة. And someone who the janaza passes by should not stand if they think that this is expected or required. Right? Right? If they think this is expected or required. Right? Right? Unless ولم يرد به ولم يرد المشي معه, unless one intends to follow the janaza, right? والأمر به منسوخ, and the Prophet's instruction to do so is abrogated, because we see from the later practice of the Prophet ﷺ, but also from the general practice of the companions, that they did not do this. Then ويكره الجلوس قبل وضعها. It's disliked for people to sit down unless there's an excuse, like someone being elderly, etc., or a need, such as you're riding your car, before placing the grave down in preparation for the body down in preparation for putting it into the grave. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم من تبع الجنازة فلا يجلس حتى توضع. That whoever follows the janaza should not sit until the janaza is placed in the grave. Right? Right? Because otherwise it's like, come on, get on with things, right? Which is not proper. And then he describes how the grave is dug. We'll continue from here after we pause for Maghrib. بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. So we'll be back in 10. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So then we start looking at how the grave should be, right? So here we can conceive of it as there's the optimal sunnah, the acceptable sunnah, and then what is done out of need or necessity, right? In terms of burial. So he says, وَيُحْفَرُ الْقَبْرُ نِصْفَ قَامَةٍ أو إلى الصدر the grave is dug nisf qama, halfway up, to half the height of the person, right? Um, or more, right? Without exaggeration, right? Um, right. So the other narration from the Imam is for the height of the person, 6 feet, right? Right. Um, right. So this being, nisf qama, is that this is the least, it should be at least nisf qama, right? Right. Or to the chest, right? So nisf qama is half the height of a person, minimally, or to the chest. وَإِن زِيدَ كَانَ حَسَنًا. If it's more, it is better. And this is not always explicitly stated. This is why when they talk about the nisf qama, that is the least that is good. But more is better because of the reasoning, which is what? لأنه أبلغ في الحفظ, because it is more emphatic in protecting the deceased, right? And this may also be affected by where the graveyard is and local considerations, right? Historically, often because graveyards would be on the outskirts of cities, right? And cities would be a lot more quiet than they are now, right? Because there wouldn't be lighting like of the same kind, and there would not be highways and cars. So animals would come, right? And buried in the ground is a whole lot of protein, right? Sorry for being blunt about it, but so as a result, it wouldn't be unusual for animals and the like to seek out this abundant protein, right? So the things that would guard, so if it needs in some place to dig deeper, for example, then one keeps those considerations in mind, of it being dug up by animals, and also in other situations where if it's near enough to living people, because once the body is buried, what happened? It starts rotting. And if it starts rotting, what's going to happen? There'll be foul smells, right? So if the graveyard is bayna adhur nas, amongst people, then there's a serious concern also of the ill smells, yeah, permeating. Okay. ويلحد في أرض صلبة من جانب القبلة. The lahad, which is like an L shape, right? So you have the chamber, and you have a little, a little L where the body goes in the direction of the qibla. ولا يشق. But this is in land where the soil is firm, because there the lahad would remain, right? ولا يشق. And the shaq is where you just have a straight trunk for the burial. يعني بحفيرة في وسط القبر, just in a hole in the middle of the grave. يوضع فيها الميت, in which the deceased is put directly. إلا في أرض رخوة, except in soil that is very soft. So for example, it's in, it's just sand. So you wouldn't be able to make a lahad. فلا بأس به فيها. So then there's nothing wrong. This is نفي لمطلق. There's nothing wrong with just having the shaq, just a chamber, just a trunk, without this little L.
Sorry, I was just praying over.
Okay.
It was a little bit earlier, not a lot.
Okay. But in these kinds of situations, one doesn't just, like, properly speaking, in non-Muslim lands, for example, even if it's the habit, etc., one should take the means of getting things done in ways that are in accordance with our teachings, right? So let's say They don't do it this way, but there's a Muslim, there's a Muslim side to the graveyard. Um, that's one of the reasons why it is, it's a fard kifaya for Muslims to be buried with Muslims, right? Right, that's a fard kifaya, right? So that we can fulfill one, so the Muslims can be buried together. Number two, so we can fulfill our funeral rites in a manner that is in accordance with our rituals, right? If not facilitated, right? If not directly facilitated, then we take the means for its facilitation, right? But having an attitude of just letting go of the sunnah just because of circumstances is not min ad-diyana, right? Particularly at the collective level, right? At the collective level, you may not be able to change everything in one individual case, but collectively, the neglect of these sunnahs of our deen leads to the erosion of attachment to religion. ولا بأس باتخاذ التابوت ولو من حديد. And there's nothing wrong with having a coffin, a tabut, a coffin, even if it be from metal. لا بأس here, if there's a need, right? Even if, this is if there's a need, right? Right? Such as if the ground is very soft, or there's other considerations, right? It's very, the graves are very close to the water level, and there's danger of contamination of the water. So there's many, many reasons that the fuqaha have mentioned. If there's a reason, right? If there's no reason, then the tabut is not directly from the sunnah, so having one otherwise would be considered disliked. Having one otherwise would be considered disliked. Right? So this is something that is problematized by some people, right? That's from lack of fiqh. They say, no, we cannot use, in some places, where it's law actually, right? Because of preservation of water levels and so on, of, the preservation of, from contamination, etc. And sometimes it may be unreasonable. So the tabut, but then one chooses, as Muslims generally do, right? That we just use the minimum coffin needed. We don't spend on coffins and so on. Spending unnecessarily on coffins, getting fancy, polished coffins, etc. That is waste of money, particularly if it be from the inheritance of the deceased, right? وَيُفْرَشُ فِيهِ التُّرَابِ. But one puts some soil at the bottom of the grave, right? Because the grave could be hard, right? If it's cut like in soil, you dig a grave, it'll be hard. So one puts a layer of sand, if facilitated. Right? Right? لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم اللحد لنا والشق لغيرنا. That this is evidence for the original position in the matan. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said the lahad is for us, this L-shaped, and the shaq, and just a chamber, a tunnel, like just a hole, is for other than us. Right? So this is referring to what is optimal, right? But in our madhab, you don't put something under the head of the deceased, right? Like a pillow or the like, or straw, right? But there's khilaf about this, right? There's khilaf. The Shafi'is said that it's good to put something under the head of the deceased. And Imam al-Saruji, one of the commentators on the Hidayah, said, I didn't see an explicit text from our companions about that. Right? But doing other things is avoided, right? There are certain customs where there's exaggeration and there's no meaning in it that is recognized in the Sharia. So Ibn Amir Hayd says, for example, sprinkling the grave with rose water first, etc. There's no basis for that, right? Um, right? Right? And they're already, we've already perfumed the shrouds and so on, and that's where, that's all that we do, right? And then he says, وَيُدْخَلُ الْمَيِّتِ فِي الْقَبْرِ مِنْ جِهَةِ الْقِبْلَةِ. The deceased are entered into the grave from the direction of the Qibla. And again, the normal proceeding in many places is that they sort of automate the lowering of the deceased into the grave. Again, this is something that if if things were set up properly by Muslims, and some places they do it, they take care, is that they say no, it's they've dug the hole, we'll take it in, right? They only put all that because the Muslims aren't ready to fulfill the Sunnah ourselves, right? Right. But of course, there has to be some ways the person will get into the grave and get out. So what do you do? Just take a ladder in, or some way of getting into the grave, because the grave is relatively deep, right? Some way that you can go down. So you bring, it's not that complicated, just bring two ladders or whatever, go down carrying the deceased into the grave. Because nobody jumps with the grave. You have to have some way of going down into the grave. So you take something that enables you to go into the grave and come out. And that is that way, because that's again becomes another neglected sunnah, right? That how is the deceased lower into the grave? Yeah, we can automate it. They could have been automated in the old days, right? People did a lot more sophisticated things than that, right? You could just tie put a little thing lower into the grave just with ropes. That's khilaf as-sunnah. Now, you don't make a scene because you show up at the burial and there's no provision for anybody to take them down. They don't know how to take it down. So these are things that we need to pay attention to if we're in situations of community responsibility. That these are sunnahs, right? But we don't create a scene, right? These are collective things that are taken care of collectively and with the people responsible for the public affairs of the Muslims, right? And if somebody can prepare these things properly, etc., the family of the deceased, etc., if they're ready for it. But a lot of times people, this needs sensitivity. Okay. كما أدخل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إن أمكن. As the Prophet was placed in his noble grave صلى الله عليه وسلم from the direction of the Qibla if facilitated. فتوضع الجنازة على القبر من جهة القبلة. So the janaza is placed at the body is placed at the grave in the direction of the Qibla. ويحمله الآخذ مستقبلا حال الأخذ. And the one who takes it from facing the Qibla when they take it, right? ويضعه في اللحد. And then one places the grave, the body, into the lahad لشرف القبلة, because that way the body can be facing the Qibla because of the nobility of the Qibla. وهو أولى من السل. And this is superior to as-sal. What is as-sal, folks? Those of you who prepared.
To put the body in, or to take the janazah from the right of the Qibla.
Yeah. Which is on the other direction of the Qibla, right? And then to take it in, right? Because so one على يمين القبلة will be on the other side of the Qibla, right? Because then that way, yes, it's as if you are putting the deceased into the grave, whereas they're carried into the grave, right? So they're put in the direction of the Qibla. The person carrying them would be closer to the grave than them, and they take them into the grave, and then they put them into the lahad. Right? لأنه يكون ابتداء الرأس. لأنه يكون ابتداء بالرأس أو يكون بالرجلين. Right? And to put them head first or leg first as well is contrary to the sunnah. وَيَقُولُ وَاضِعُهُ, and the person putting them in the grave says في قبر يعني في قبره كما أمر به النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, as the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم commanded. وكان يقول, and the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم would commanded that we say it, command of encouragement, not of obligation, and he would do it himself, or he would say it himself. إذا أدخل الميت القبر, and when he would insert the deceased into the grave, بسم الله وعلى ملة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, by the name of Allah and upon the way of the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم. Millah refers to community or way, and there's a relationship between millah and deen and ummah. And these three terms have interrelationships but distinct senses. قال شمس الأئمة السرخسي رحمه الله تعالى أي بسم الله وضعناك, and what it means by the name of Allah is by the name of Allah we have placed you, and upon the millah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam we have left you, right? So, and upon this community of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the way of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have now entrusted you, to the next life. وفي الظاهرية إذا وضعوه قالوا بسم الله وبالله وفي الله وعلى ملة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Right? In the Zahiriyya it mentions, if they place it, they say in the name of Allah and by Allah and for Allah and upon the way of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And this is based on the thing that one can, the Salaf differed, that the Adhkar that are related from the Prophet, are they said only as they're related, or their dhikr, one can add other expressions to them, and there's a lot of evidence that the Sahaba themselves and the Tabi'een would do the Sunnah dhikrs and add to them. But the optimum way is that if you want to add the like of this, which is mentioned from early Muslims in its various parts, is to say both, right? Bismillah ala millati Rasulillah, but we can add these other things as well, and they also bring out the meanings, right, of Bismillah, because the Basmala contains within it the meaning of reliance upon Allah, and Fillah, a lillah, right? So these bring out the shades of meaning, right? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. ولا يضر دخول وتر أو شفع في القبر بقدر الكفاية. There's no harm with an odd or an even number of people entering the grave to the extent of the need, right? If two people are enough, 2 people go down. If 3 go down, it's fine. But let's say 4 needed to carry him, because nice hefty person, but then there's no need to have a 5th person go in. So to the extent of the need, right? But was sunnatu al-witr. But the sunnah is for it to be an odd number of people, right? Because it's not just the need, but to do it in a sufficient manner, right? Because 2 people could carry it, but if you could have a 3rd, that'll facilitate it. That takes care of the issue of witr, and it's more emphatic with respect to putting the person in the grave. When yakunu aqwiya umana sulaha, and they be strong, so it can fulfill the responsibility, trustworthy, because if anything becomes uncovered or there's a bad smell or whatever, that they be trustworthy people. Sulaha, righteous, because this is a religious duty, and you taqdeem as-salih. And one gives, in religious matters, one gives precedence to people of righteousness. وَذُو رَحِمْ, or immediate family member, mahram, awla, and they have more right. Particularly بإدخال المرأة, with respect to entering the woman. ثم ذو الرحم غير المحرم, then the immediate family who are not mahram, right? ثم الصالح من المشايخ, then with respect the righteous scholars, right? And mashayikh here, right, is scholars or of those, the righteous of those who are older, right? And they differ, right? Mashayikh it is said, can refer to those who reach the age of who've gone past the age of 30 till 50, and then we become ajuz. But there are other opinions that here means someone who is older, right? An older person. So a woman has to be buried. Either immediate family puts her in the grave, or non-immediate family, or older individuals, and they don't put a specific date. That's why it is said that 30 and above, but this is not, right? This is in terms of lugha, because many terms have a range of usages, right? Like even terms like rawha, ghadwa, right? There, it depends on what you're contrasting it with, because you can divide the stages of life into 7 or 9 stages, in which each one has a more narrow part. But then you have when someone becomes an elder, they're a shab, and then they're a sheikh. In that sense, it is after 40, and the sheikh includes in it after 40. The sheikh can be ajuz, and then you have the sheikh who's ajuz, and then the sheikh who's fani. That's above 40, and then you have elderly, and then you have like very elderly. But if you break it down further, then sheikh is between 30 and 50, where someone is mature, but not yet ajuz, but not yet elderly. Right? Anyways, so then then righteous elders from the elders of her neighborhood. Then, if they're not available, then righteous younger people, which would be those under 40, for example. ولا يدخل أحد من النساء القبر. No women enter the grave, because خلاف السنة. And we don't, and non-Muslims would not enter the grave of a Muslim, right? Even if they are immediate family of deceased, as Imam al-Tahtawi mentions from Ibn Amir al-Hajj. ولا يخرجهن إلا الرجال ولو كانوا أجانب, right? 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 And they're not taken forth, meaning taken forth from the funerary rites of the prayer, etc., to the grave, except for men. They were carrying them from the place of prayer to the place of burial, except for men. And there's some ikhtilaf about the copies of the Maraqi here, as pointed out by Imam Tahtawi. وَلَوْ كَانُوا أَجَانِبَ, even if they're unrelated, when the immediate family is not available, someone died in a foreign land or something, right? لأن مس الأجنبي لها بحائل عند الضرورة جائز, because the touching of someone unrelated to her through a barrier, حائل يمنع الحرارة, right? Considered when there is ضرورة, when there is necessity, is permitted. في حياتها, in her life. فكذا بعد موتها, right? But عند الضرورة, when أي عند الحاجة المعتبرة شرعا, Sharia recognized need, right? Such as mudawa, right? Such as medical treatment. So the basis is that we with medical treatment, of course, medical treatment that requires physical contact, the basis is that men would see a male doctor and women would see a female doctor when equivalent doctors are available. And the fact that someone's qualified means that they're qualified, right? In most places, people don't become doctors just by faking it, right? Unless they're in the place where they are faking it, right? There are places, one of the national airlines of a Muslim country, للأسف, got banned from many international routes because they found something like 30% of the pilots were not qualified. And so if that's the case, then you may need to question the qualifications, right? But in general, if they're available, then you must, in the kind of treatment that requires either physical contact or uncovering of awrah, then they have to, one has to seek someone of the same sex. Of course, if if there's the need, medical treatment is a need, and no one of the same sex is available, then that's a separate matter. But one also needs to take the means, right? Some people say, oh, someone's having a child, and they planned everything. I said, oh, only a male doctor was available for the delivery. But you planned out everything up to and including the minutiae of what kind of food you were eating and what supplements you were taking and all these things. But the things related to fulfillment of your duties, you're negligent of. And similarly, in things like this, so medical treatment. But then if that contact can be done with a barrier, then it needs to be done with a barrier. Like, for example, if they need to do some kind of check, but they wear gloves, for example, right? Or they can touch the affected area without uncovering. But if there's a need to uncover, then it would be only the area required to uncover. And of course, there's also the rulings of khalwa between doctor and patient. And there needs to be a third party. Practically, one should take someone with one, right? Wherever possible, right? Because very often, for example, the doctor may be of the same sex, but the many tests are run by someone, by someone of the opposite sex, and just to have somebody with one, or to keep the door open. And like when I'd go for eye test, sometimes they'd go close the door, I just open it slightly, right? Because in some things, like they're just quickly checking the eye, whatever. There's no physical contact, but that's still, although technically there's people straight outside, so it may legally not be khalwa, but you take someone with you. And the ahkam of medical treatments are mentioned in the books of halal and haram, and we have some answers related to it as well. وَيُوَجَّهُ إِلَى الْقِبْلَةِ عَلَى جَنْبِهِ الْأَيْمَنِ. Whichever way the person's placed in the grave, they are turned on their right side in the direction of the qibla. Right? And this is wajib. Right? This is wajib. It's from the rights of the deceased to do so. Right? As mentioned in the Durr al-Mukhtar, others said it's a sunnah mu'akkada. Right? Right? But what's in the Durr al-Mukhtar would be given precedence over what's in Ibn Amir Hajj, because Durr al-Mukhtar came later and it's more relied upon for fatwa. بذلك أمر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. That was what was commanded by the beloved Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. وفي حديث أبي داود أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال البيت الحرام قبلتكم أحياء وأمواتا. In the hadith in Abu Dawud, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, the sacred house is your qibla when alive and when dead. Right? So which is why it's best to face the qibla when in عامة أمورنا من غير تكلف. In the generality of affairs without takalluf. And there's other hadiths, some of which are mentioned by Imam al-Tahtawi. And وتحل العقدة لأمر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لسيدنا سمرة رضي الله تعالى عنه بذلك وقد مات له ابن. Because the Prophet said, so that if one had tied the shroud, right, then one undoes the knots. The Prophet commanded Sayyidina Samura when radiallahu ta'ala, when a child of his died, أطلق عقد رأسه وعقد رجليه, that untie the knots at his head and at his feet. ولأنه آمن من الانتشار, because now once you place them in the grave, you undo the knots because now it's not going to spread. ويسوى اللبن بكسر الباء الموحدة واحده لبن بوزن كلمة الطوب النيء. And unbaked bricks are placed over. So you put in the lahad and you place unbaked bricks, at a slight incline, right? So that way, the deceased is in the lahad, in the L of the lahad, and these unbaked bricks are placed over it, so that when the soil is placed down, the deceased is sort of like in a little micro chamber, right? الطوب النيء عليه, on top of them. أي على اللحد اتقاء لوجهه من التراب. And this is also closer to dignifying the deceased, that there's something covering them when we pour the soil over them. And because this is the sunnah. لما روي أنه عليه الصلاة والسلام جعل على قبره اللبن, because it's related that on the grave of the Prophet, meaning on the Prophet, above the Prophet, they put labin, right? وروي, what do you have, Omar? طن من قصب, right? طن من قصب, right? Or they differed. Was it of mud or was it qasab, which is what they call like cane, right? That had pieces of cane put together. So it's just something that serves as a barrier, so that the soil doesn't come directly onto the grave directly. ولا منافاة لإمكان الجمع بوضع اللبن منصوبا ثم أكمل بالقصب. And there's no necessary contradiction between the hadith, because it's possible that both could have been played, that they put the lebin, the unbaked bricks, and then above that they put the qasab, the straw on top of it, right? وقال محمد في الجامع الصغير ويستحب القصب. And Imam Muhammad said in الجامع الصغير, it's recommended to put qasab واللبن, to join between both. And the reason he references this is because Imam Shurunbulali frequently does things like this, because this is not so commonly mentioned, right? It's not so commonly mentioned. So sometimes, because most of the rulings, he's transmitting things that are well established, right? So he's not necessarily in his mukhtasar. And many of the things that he mentions unreferenced in the Maraqi are often referenced, like where he got it from, in the Imdad. Not always, but frequently. But because this is not so commonly mentioned, right? So he mentioned this is actually stated explicitly in Jami' al-Saghir, which is one of the major works of Zahir al-Riwayah. Right? Of course, al-Jami' al-Saghir is what. So what did Maulana al-Marghinani do in his Matn al-Bidayah? He took Quduri, the Bidayah, which he commented upon in the Hidayah. He took Quduri and appended to it critical issues from al-Jami' al-Saghir. So this is recommended. وقال في الأصل اللبن والقصب, right? And he said similarly in al-Asl, one of the books of Zahir al-Riwayah, also known as al-Mabsut of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan. Right? And the Mabsut was written before al-Jami' al-Saghir. That's much, much larger in size. فدل المذكور في الجامع على أنه لا بأس بالجمع بينهما. So what's mentioned in al-Jami' al-Saghir indicates there's nothing wrong with joining between the two, and that's how we understand the two hadiths together. واختلف في القصب المنسوج. And there's difference of opinion whether it's also plays with, because the qasab is just to put like, you know, like cane or, you know, or qasab is wood that has a hole, like cane, right? Or the like, or sticks of wood even, right? But what if it's tied together, right? Mansuj, like, so it's weaved together. So they differed on it. He doesn't take a stance. Why? But it's better to avoid, right? Because it's takalluf, and the asl is that takalluf is avoided with relate any things related to the deceased. ويكره إلقاء الحصير في القبر. It's disliked to place a hasir, a mat, in the grave. وهذا عند الوجدان. وفي محل لا يوجد إلا الصخر فلا كراهة فيه. Right? But that's if one finds other things to put on the, you know, at the bottom of the grave. But if there's a place where there's nothing else to put, like the sand at the bottom of the grave, then there's nothing wrong. And there's sakhar, it's stony. It's undignified of the deceased that you put them straight on rocks, right? And some soil is really that hard, right? In mountainous areas, etc., that you go dig a little bit and you can't go further because you've reached rocks. So there, if you put a mat down, so there's nothing wrong. فلا كراهة فيه. فقولهم وكره وضع الآجر بالمد المحرق من اللبن والخشب محمول على وجود اللبن بلا كلفة. So they're saying that it's disliked to place ajur, which is baked bricks or wood, right? It's interpreted when unbaked bricks are available without difficulty. وإلا فقد يكون الخشب والآجر موجودين, right? Because it may be that wood or baked clay may be what's available. So then there's no takalluf and there's no israf, right? ويقدم اللبن لأن الكراهة لكونهما للإحكام والزينة, right? But one gives precedence to unbaked bricks, because the reason why one avoids baked bricks or, you know, or wood or, you know, other things that are fancier is because these are for reinforcement and adornment, and we don't need to reinforce you know, within the grave beyond the lebin, right? Nor there's any reason to adorn. So that's why we also don't get the basis is that we don't use a coffin. If there's needed, we get the minimum coffin, something that decomposes quickly and is not costly. ولذا قال بعض مشايخنا إنما يكره الآجر إذا أريد به الزينة. That's why some of our mashayikh said that ajur, right, baked bricks are only disliked if they're done for adornment or tafakhur, right? Or like we go fancy, other people go simple, we go fancy. أما إذا أريد به دفع أذى السباع. But if one uses it to avoid the harm of wild animals, أو شيء آخر, or some other matter, i.e. معتبر, يعني that is some reasonable consideration, فلا يكره, then there's nothing disliked, right? 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 And this is related as well, right? وما قيل إنه لمس النار فليس بصحيح. And the reason given by some scholars that the reason you avoid baked clay because it's been touched by the fire, this is incorrect. Right? Right? Because you'd wash the deceased with warm water, and the warm water classically would be touched with fire, right? So that's just, sometimes things are mentioned that are hikmah, that someone is mentioning a wisdom. والحكمة لا يشترط اضطرادها. The wisdom does not have to be always met, etc. That's sort of just like a general explanation. Okay. ويستحب أن يسجى أي يسترى قبرها أي المرأة سترا لها إلى أن يسوى عليها اللحد. لا يسجى قبره أي الرجل، لأن سيدنا عليا رضي الله تعالى عنه مر بقوم قد دفنوا ميتا وبسطوا على قبره ثوبا فجذب به وقال إنما يصنع هذا بالنساء إلا إذا كان لضرورة دفع حر أو مطر أو ثلج من الداخلين في القبر فلا بأس به. So it is recommended that one tent over, one cover over the woman's grave during the burial proceedings. This is for the woman, in order that she be concealed until the labin is put. So until she's put in the grave, into the lahad, and then the labin, the unbaked bricks are put in place. But this is not done for a man, right? Because mabna amr nisa ala satr. Because the basis of women is satr, and this is actually, Sayyidah Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha asked that this be done for her, right? And there's a few things that she requested in her wasiyah. Amongst them, she heard from Sayyidah Asma that in Abyssinia, when they'd carry the funerals of women, what would they do? They would put palm fronds on top of them, right? Because it was Esther. And this was not something the Prophet ﷺ had said to do, etc. Sayyidah Fatima embraced that. She says, I want that to be done as well. And the fuqaha mentioned that's an example that it is not makruh to do what non-Muslims do in general. Innama at-tashabbuh, imitation, is when there's either qasd or tamyiz, right? When it's either deliberate, I want to be like the non-Muslims, or when if one does it in makana min ma'alimi kufrihim aw fisqihim, right? So tashabbuh, right? Tashabbuh, imitation, is either when you want to be like non-Muslims rather than Muslims, or when you do it in the distinctive symbols of their disbelief or their corruption. Amma mutlaqul mushabaha, as for just doing something that they do, then it's not disliked, right? Particularly if there's a benefit in it, right? If there's a benefit in it. But of course, marji' dhalik, that if this praiseworthy or blameworthy, shawirul hukama, consult the people of understanding, of wisdom. So Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu passed by people who buried a dead person, and they put a cloth to cover over the grave, and he removed it, and he said, this is only done for women, right? Unless that is out of darura. Darura is not necessity, because nobody's going to die in the sun. Darura, the fuqaha use it for al-hajatul mu'tabara, for a recognized need, to avoid لدفع حر أي شديد, right? Intense heat, or heavy rain, or snow from those who would be entering upon the grave. Then there's nothing wrong with it. وَيُهَالُ التُّرَابِ سَتْرًا لَهُ. And then after all this, one puts the soil in the grave to cover over the grave. ويستحب أن يحثي ثلاث حثيات لما روي أنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى على جنازة ثم أتى إلى القبر فحث عليه التراب من قبل رأسه ثلاثا. And it's recommended to take 3 handfuls of soil and to place them on the grave, because the Prophet ﷺ passed by, prayed over a janazah, and then came to the grave, and he put 3 handfuls of soil from the direction of the head. And the hadith, and there's many different hadiths about this. So this is from the sunnahs of burial, right? For anyone who witnesses the funeral, right? And they mention different verses to recite there, etc., right? These are not necessarily specifically sunnah, but these are facilitations given by the ulama to help people reflect. Right? So there's a wasail لتحقيق سنة التفكر. Right? These are means to facilitate the sunnah of reflecting during the proceedings. وَيُسَنَّمُ الْقَبْرِ. Now, if you put the deceased in and you made the lahad, there'll be some extra soil. So one has a rounded mound on top of the grave. Yusannam, right? It's like the hump of a camel. So the grave, the extra soil is put into a hump shape, right? But only with the soil displaced from the grave. ويكره أن يزيد فيه على التراب الذي خرج منه. But it's makruh to add other soil to the soil that was taken from the grave, unless something extraordinary happened, right? 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 Unless something happened, right? That it was raining and some of the soil washed away or something, then that's haja. This is obvious. And they discussed that. Or the soil was soft and the wind blew and it blew away or whatever. I mean, obvious things, right? Because we have to fill the grave and add and have a little more. ويجعله مرتفعا عن الأرض قدر شبر أو أكثر بقليل. And when it makes it above, rise above the ground, the extent of a shibr, a handspan, or a little more. ولا بأس برش الماء عليه حفظا له. And there's nothing wrong with sprinkling water on it. Rush is just a light sprinkle, just to keep it in place, right? But rather, and this is nothing wrong with it. Imam Tahtawi says, بل ينبغي. This should be done, and it's recommended because the Prophet ﷺ did it, right? Both with the grave of Sayyidina Sa'id and his son's grave, and he commanded it for the grave of Sayyidina Uthman ibn Maz'un, right? And you can read the section in, right? ولا يربع, and one doesn't, so one keeps it in this sanam, like a humped shape, right? ولا يربع, and one does not turn into a square, right? Though Imam Shafi'i said that that's superior, there's khilaf about it, but this is our madhab. لنهي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن تربيع القبور وتجصيصها. The Prophet interdicted doing this and also from reinforcing them with gypsum, right? ولا يجصص, and one does not reinforce it with gypsum or other things. One doesn't reinforce them. The ulama said this is above the grave particularly, right? If there's a need for the grave not to disintegrate, to put something around the grave without takalluf, then there's nothing wrong with it. And they do this in many land, right? Depends on the soil, right? So if one put bricks around or reinforce around the grave just to keep the grave in place and to keep the graves distinct, that's not wrong. but tajsis on top of it should be avoided. Right? ويحرم البناء عليه للزينة, and it's prohibited to build on top of it out of adornment. لما روينا, because of what we have narrated, right? The Prophet forbade it, Right? Now he, of course, in the Maraqi has not related that hadith. Right? So he's saying because the Prophet forbade it and said because of what we have related, he's not technically related it. Yeah. But here he's saying about what we have um, um, and he mentions Tahtawi mentions some of the hadiths about this. ويكره البناء عليه للإحكام بعد الدفن, and it's makruh to build on the grave after the burial as well for the purpose of reinforcing the grave. لأنه للبقاء, because that's for remaining. والقبر للفناء, and the grave is for this, for death, for ending. وأما قبل الدفن فليس بقبر, but before burial it's not a grave. وفي النوازل لا بأس بتطيينه, and in the nawazil it has come that there's nothing wrong with reinforcing it with mud, which is take the soil, put some water, and then it'll harden. وفي الغياثية وعليه الفتوى, and they said that there's fatwa on it, right? So you take the soil out, put a little water, you mix it, you put it on top, so it just will stay in place, right? وعليه الفتوى. Right? ولا بأس أيضا بالكتابة في حجر صين به القبر ووضع عليه لئلا يذهب لئلا يذهب الأثر فيحترم للعلم بصاحبه ولا يمتهن. And there's nothing wrong also with writing on a stone, for example, by which one reinforces the grave, even if it's put on it, but it's better to put it at the head or the foot of the grave. Right? But then sometimes some places, and it can differ from place to place, right? Because in some places if you put it vertical, what would happen? If wind blows a lot, it'll get blown over, right? If you put it at the foot of the grave, right? If there's a lot of rain, it'll get washed away, right? So some of these things, they differ. In itself, it's better to put it at the head or the foot of the grave, to have a stone or other in which the name of the deceased is written. There's nothing wrong with it. Right? Right? And then the ulama joined between what the fuqaha said of permission and of the hadith of not writing on the grave, is that if there's a need to be able to distinguish the graves, then there's nothing wrong with writing. The writing just for the purpose of mere adornment is to be avoided. And that's what the amal of the ulama is upon, right? That ulama but they keep the grave simple, etc. So that it be known who's buried, and so that la yumtahan, so that it not be disrespected. And also another reason they frequently will put something around the grave, just without takalluf, whether it be mud or to the extent that it's basically needed. So that also, like you see, for example, here in Canada, they just flatten the soil completely. What's the problem with that? If you go to the graveyard, even if you do your best, it is extremely difficult to know where the people buried are, right? And you're not supposed to walk over the grave as well. وعن أبي يوسف أنه كره أن يكتب عليه. And there's a narration from Abu Yusuf that he disliked that anything be written on top of it. وإذا خربت القبور فلا بأس بتطينها. But if the graves disintegrate, there's nothing wrong with reinforcing them with mud, right? لأن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مر بقبر ابنه إبراهيم عليه السلام فرأى فيه حجرا فسده وقال من عمل عملا فليتقنه. Because the Prophet ﷺ passed by the grave of his son Ibrahim عليه السلام, and he saw a stone in it, so he removed it and filled it in, and he said whoever does something, let them perfect it. And that's a general principle in our deen. right? وعن أنس عن سيدنا أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال خفق الرياح وقطر الأمطار على قبر المؤمن كفارة لذنوبه. That the blowing of the wind, the Prophet ﷺ said, the blowing of the wind and the descent of rain on the grave of the believer is an expiation for their sins. Allahu Alam. That's why the interesting thing for our literalist brethren, because they say you can't have, graves of the righteous that are built over. One of the great books of the Hanbalis, of the biographies of the Hanbalis, called الصحب الوابلة على ضرائح الحنابلة. The full clouds sending down abundant rain upon the graves of the Hanbalis. That's sort of the colorful title of the biographies of the great Hanbali scholars. One of the great biographical works. Anyways, but that's just an aside. وَيُكْرَهُ الدَّفْنُ فِي الْبُيُوتِ. It's disliked to bury in houses, right? لاختصاصه بالأنبياء عليهم الصلاة والسلام, because that is unique to the prophets. May Allah be well pleased with them. قال الكمال أي ابن الهمام لا يدفن صغير ولا كبير في البيت الذي مات فيه. That Al-Kamal said that no one is buried in the house that they died in, whether small or old. Because someone said they just buried the child there. And there's many personal and social wisdoms in that. فإن ذلك خاص بالأنبياء, because that's from the unique things of prophets. Prophets are buried where they died, right? عليهم الصلاة والسلام. بل يدفن في مقابر المسلمين, but rather they're buried in the graves, in the graveyards of the Muslims. ويكره الدفن في الأماكن التي تسمى الفساقي, وهي كبيت معقود بالبناء يسع جماعة قياما ونحوه لمخالفتها السنة. And it's disliked to bury people in burial homes, right? And they did this in several lands. They do this, right? Right? Where it would be like a home, right? Where sometimes, and they do it in many ways. Sometimes they actually stack the deceased vertically. In others, they would be like, they'd have like, they build like almost like a tunnel, and they would put the deceased in layers. There's a number of examples. Some of these can be found in some of the graveyards in Cairo, right? And there's reasons people did it, because of crowding and so on, right? And you can see some of the description in Tahtawi, but there's also, you can see the burial chambers in Cairo about it. But generally, this is makruh to do, because it goes against multiple sunnahs of each dead person having their grave, and all the different sunnahs of burial. And then he mentions a number of furu'. We'll continue from here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm a bit confused about the reasoning about this last issue, that crypts are disliked because it's using them is mukhalif to sunnah. But what about like, does differing from the sunnah itself entail karaha? What about urf? Isn't that taken into consideration?
No, because the sunnahs of there are sunnahs that are custom, and there are sunnahs that are legislative, right? So the rites of burial are legislative sunnahs, right? They're legislative sunnahs. We've been called upon, and we've been commanded to follow particular practices, right? So going against those particular practices, those are legislative sunnahs, right? They're sunan min sunan al-din. They're from the sunnahs of deen. Uh, they're not merely, they're not just sunan al-ada, right? So in that sense, and those also those sunan also become sha'air al-muslimin. They become from the symbols of the believers, right? And sometimes even adab gain legislative basis, right? That someone ate with their left hand in itself is makruh tanzihan, but it's not just makruh tanzihan because these have become from the symbols of the believers, right? Um, and when it comes to burial practices, then definitely, right? And also, and there's many things related to, to preserving the distinctness of a believer from others is a major shari'i consideration. There's a lot related to that. Other questions?
We took that building on the graves is makruh. How do we understand a lot of the graves of the scholars that have like big structures over the graves?
That's a good question. No, so that, so building, he says it's makruh to build on them lizina, right? For adornment, right? Now, then of the ulama, there are those who insisted and practiced that we will not build upon the grave in any way whatsoever, right? But then there's also a practical thing, right? That if a grave is going to be visited by a whole bunch of people, right? They go to a graveyard. People are going to go to a graveyard. Let's say you're going to visit the grave of, let's say, Imam al-Karhi, wherever Imam al-Karhi is buried. Do you want to have to look forever to find the grave of Imam al-Karhi? No, right? So this is not for zina. It's one, to be able to find it, and number two, if a lot of people are going to gather in a grave and it gets hot, cold, wet, etc., then you put something on the grave so that people who go visit the graves of the righteous, that they can comfortably visit them, because we've been commanded to visit the graves, particularly of the righteous, and to reflect there, etc., etc. So this is something that operationally a lot of the ummah accepted, generation after generation. In itself, sticking to the sunnah is superior, right? But they say this is, the reasons for its prohibition are للتفاخر, it's done out of boasting, or zina, or of adornment, or إضاعة المال, or wasting money, or if it busies up the lands of waqf lands, unless the waqf has a provision for the burial of the ulama and the righteous, etc. Or the like of this, right? Or the like of this. Then that consideration would apply. But there is, this is one of those things that they're just a reality, right? That a lot of the ulama saw there's different reasons why they did this throughout history, right? And they say, well, mutawarith la yakunu bid'ah. That which is from inherited practices is not bid'ah if done within the parameters of those considerations, right? And that's why you have across the Muslim lands of Ahl al-Ilm wal-Khair wal-Salah, people who did it. So it is something that they did. They did not see a going against the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because the meanings, you can discern 4, 5, 6 meanings for the prohibition of building over graves: adornment, boasting, wasting money, imitation of non-Muslims, it become a place of worship, but the believers do not worship the righteous. That's very, very clear, right? So then you know, a lot of the ulama practice it, that this is the practice of the ulama and so on, that they say that this can be done for obvious practical reasons. But even then, you see that the ulama took into account those considerations different ways. For example, the Ottomans had a very nice way. You can see if you look at you can look up some Ottoman graveyards kind of thing. What they did, the ulama, they would keep the ulama in many of the graveyards. For example, at the Sulaymaniya, Sulaiman al-Qanuni is buried. The ulama would have a Rawdatul Ulama, right? The garden of the scholars. They'd be buried together, so you could find them. And then what they would do, what would they do? The Ottomans were very practical, right? They would, on top of the gravestone would have a symbol, so you could tell who is. Like the ulama would have a stone turban on their grave. Government officials would have like one of those Turkish hats, right? And then there's other descriptors as well, like so it'd be not difficult to find the grave, and they would use a gravestone, and they're practical considerations, right? Because I'm going looking for the grave of Imam Ahmad Din Qumishkhanwi, I want to be able to find it, right? So there's practical living considerations too, right? So, but so the ulama frequently, many of them specifically sought not to be buried in fancy ways, and that's what we've seen in actually right around the corner from Sheikh Mu'min's house, behind Sharia Baghdad in Damascus, was the famous graveyard called Maqbaratul Dahdah, and that's where Sheikh Muhammad al-Hashimi al-Tilimsani was buried. And that there's a graveyard, and there's a section of the grave called Rawdatul Ulama. So it was distinct, and it was demarcated, but the graves just had clear gravestones. They're reinforced from the side, not built over. That fulfilled the need. And a number of great scholars, Sheikh Abul Khair al-Maydani and Sheikh Lutf al-Fayyumi and others, were buried there. And in other places, they built on them, and the ulama accepted it. And in the greatest cities of Islam, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Baghdad, in the heyday of Islamic knowledge and scholarship, the ulama accepted it, and they gave fatwa permitting it. And you can see the discussion in Hashid ibn Abdin. You can also see it in the Shafi'i school, in the commentaries on the Hawashi, on the Shuruh and Hawashi on the Minhaj, etc. There's a khilaf there. So it's not something that it's not within the da'ira, the circle of that which can be condemned. Because لا إنكار في مسائل الخلاف. Okay. Any other questions?
Again, going back to the lahad, so
and we're not again going back to it, Sidi.
Sorry. Question about the lahad. Is the entire body inside the niche, or is it a portion of the body in the niche?
Ideally, the whole body.
And so then, why would the bricks be on a slant? Why would they just be straight, sealing the body away from the straight part of the grave?
They're on an experiment, Sidi. You put soil, the soil goes down, and what's the soil going to do? Soil comes down, it's going to go and fill in that gap. There's scientific terms for that, right? Just try it out, do a micro trial. Okay? You pour it down. It's as it starts filling up, it'll start going and crowding in the body. Right? And the gap remains. As soil comes down, it'll fill in that gap. So that's where you put that to prevent that.
But why are the bricks slanted? Why can't they just be straight, sealing the niche away from the
slant? Does not mean a 45 angle. It's slightly slanted to prevent it going in. If you put it just completely straight, it's a practical reason. If you put it straight, it could fall over, right? And also, and then it depends on circumstances. How much of a hole are you able to make, etc. That there's a lot of leeway and flexibility in that.
Another question?
So there's several reasons. One, because that's how it's related, number one, right? Number two, there are number of evident wisdoms. Number three is also, of course, the consideration. What's of facilitation?
Um, when Imam Shurunbulali said ويكره اتباع النساء الجنائز وإن لم تنزجر نائحة, what is the وإن mean in this sentence?
The two separate things. The waw is for atf. The two are unrelated.
So how would the in be translated? وإن لم تنزجر نائحة.
If, just if, and if a na'iha, so if there is a na'iha, and if she doesn't desist, the na'iha, no, someone who cries out, right? No is moaning, literally. No is the moaning, crying, right? No hamam, right? It's like the sound a dove makes of crying, right? يعني غرد تغريد البلابل ونوح الحمام, right?
Wouldn't the sentence then mean ويكره اتباع النساء الجنائز? It's makruh for women to follow the janaiz. وإن, if they are not, if وإن لم تنزجر, if they're not.
The واو is للعطف. The واو here is لمطلق الجمع. They're two separate issues, right? So the واو here, I mean, I have to look at it grammatically. Does it fit the criteria of isti'naf? But this is a new issue. It's a dislike for women to follow the janaza, and that's mu'allal. That's a separate discussion. It's mu'allal. Separate issue, right? So it's like a new issue, right? Right? It's related, the waw, the atf, and is it considered istinaf, right? I don't have the issue in front of me, but and if the na'iha la tanzajir, if the na'iha doesn't, doesn't pay heed, right? Then you can walk with her, but just keep away from her. Of course, the na'iha, it's already known because it's the karaha of niyaha, of crying out loud, etc., is obviously known, right? And it's understood by the context that he's saying, if she doesn't desist, then this is what you do. That is understood. That's then there's nothing wrong to walk with her. Right? So the waw would appear to be like it's a separate issue. I'm not willing to say if it's enough or not, but it would appear to be at least in meaning. Grammatically, is it istinaf? That's a separate matter, right? You can check in Qa'ad al-I'rab and elsewhere what are the shurut of the waw al-istinaf, right? Any other questions?
Yes, please. I was just wondering regarding sprinkling rose water over a grave, that it's not recommended. However, is there karaha in it?
Yeah, because there's no need to do so, right? There is a time to perfume the body, to perfume the shrouds, right? In that. If someone just happens to do it, like there's also, you have to be sensitive, right? Like someone goes and they open a bottle of oud and they empty it on the grave. There's some things that you let people be, right? You let people be. You don't say, yeah, it's fine, right? But there's some things you let people. It's not some major munkar, right? Like someone, let's say in some culture, let's say they, some cultures they use rose water as because they have alcohol in it, like in Turkey, they use it as disinfectant. Very much Hanafis, right? The Shafi'is. Turkey is like the Shafi'is' nightmare in that sense, because the Shafi'is, that's najis. They use either rose water or lemon water with alcohol. They want to sprinkle some perfume on it. There's certain things that are let people, should not be done, but but it should not be, people should not be forbidden harshly about it, etc. Because these are um, sensitive matters, right? Like in the, you know, like in the case, for example, at a grave, right? The adab is one doesn't touch a grave, one does not kiss a grave, but someone goes and does that. Right? You also have to be, there's a what is proper, but also one has to be sensitive to the state of the person, right? Okay. We will we'll start the Tariq al-Muhammadiyya inshallah in 6 minutes بإذن الله. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.